thank you, Brian, for a lovely introduction. And thank you, Brian and Anna, for introducing me and bringing me back here. And I want to introduce all of you to this fantastic woman, Countess Anna Friederike Wilhelmina von Hallwyl, who was born on the 1st of October, 1844, and died on the 25th of July, 1930. Now, you may ask what I have to do with Sweden, or with the Countess, or with her collection, which was left to the Swedish state. And the answer is that I was introduced to the museum through the good offices of my friend and colleague, Errol Manners. Errol had been advising the curator there, the curator of decorative arts, on some European ceramics, and they wanted to recatalogue their Asian ceramics. I'll talk about recataloguing in a minute. And so I was introduced, and I spent some happy years going to Stockholm and working there with the curators and looking at the collection. And in 2016, we published this book I worked with Ingalill Jansson on writing the book and looking at the collection. And because this is a state museum, a Swedish state museum, the book was published in 2 editions, one in Swedish and one in English. Because obviously it's a national project. So I was very excited to be translated into Swedish. I've never had that happen before, but it did. So, where is this museum? Well, I have to first of all admit to you with shame that prior to Errol's introduction, I hadn't heard of the Chinese ceramics in this museum. I knew about Chinese collections in Stockholm because of the late, great King Gustav, who was a great collector, who contributed pieces and helped found the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities in 1926. And that's a very famous museum to us Chinese boffins. I used to go there often, but I had never known about the Hallwyl Museum. And I was really embarrassed because it's a wonderful museum. I'm sure that you all know it, but of many things. But among its collections, it has more than 1,000 pieces of Chinese ceramic. It has Japanese ceramics. It's got 10 Korean ceramics, and it's got 1 Thai pot. But I'm going to be talking to you about the Chinese things today, not the others. So this lovely museum. Before introducing you to the museum, I ought to say something about Sweden and China, because they do have links that go back. The Swedes were and are great engineers. And in the early 20th century, there was not great opportunities for work in Sweden. And so after the Russian-Japanese War came to an end in 1905, 1906, the Far East was open again to Europeans. And several Swedish engineers traveled out to China to help build the infrastructure. One of them was a man called Orvar Karlbeck, and I'll come back to him. He was quite a character. The other one was a man you can see in this photograph, J.G. Anderson, or perhaps I should say Andersson. My Swedish isn't very good, but that's how it's said there. And he's standing here, and he's standing beside who was then the crown prince, this tall figure, and the crown princess. And this is the man who later became the King of Sweden and who was a great collector of Asian art, and many of you will remember him being in London buying. He was a great inspirer, really, of the field. In 1926, he went to China, and here he is with Anderson and friends, standing in part of the Forbidden City. And Anderson is another of those Swedish mining engineers. He had first gone out to China in 1914, And he was also an archaeologist, and he'd actually been invited by Chinese authorities to carry out excavations in North China. Because, of course, when mining activity takes place, they build railroads and things. What do you find in the ground except precious old treasures? In fact, you could say in China, you only need to dig a spade in the ground and you find something. You know, it's such a rich, particularly in the north. So these men in the from 1906 onwards, in the 1910s, were actually practicing archaeology in China. So Anderson took care of the Crown Prince and Crown Princess, and they even, they even indulged in some archaeology. And I like this photograph very much because the royal bottom is pointing upwards here. I like these incredulous Chinese peasants at the top here, kind of peering down into the pit and thinking, what on earth is going on? But this visit to China really ignited the Crown Prince's interest. He had been collecting Chinese art prior to this time, from the 1910s really onwards, but this really cemented it for him. So there was this great thing going on in Sweden about China, and Wilhelmina fitted into all this. When the Crown Prince first started buying Chinese art, Wilhelmina, who was a member of the nobility, often met with him, and in her diaries, she notes that when good things came in from China, the king had first pick and I had second pick. So she was part of that circle of people who acquired Chinese art. So, the museum. If you don't know it, it's in downtown Stockholm. It's right in the middle of Stockholm. It's a few doors along from the Opera House, and it's across the little square. Do you know the auctioneering firm of Bukowski's? It's sort of across the square from there. And in fact, the Countess Wilhelmina bought almost entirely from Bukowski's, so she only had to trot across the square to the front door of the auction house, and there were the things that she bought. And so it's this wonderful house that was built by the Countess and her husband in the 1890s in the latest style, a famous architect called Isaac Gustav Clausen. And it was built between 1893 and 1898, this building. And it was built in entirely to most modern standards. I mean, it had lifts, it had plumbing, it had electricity. And on the top floor, it had a gymnasium. When the Countess, she bequeathed the house and all its contents to the Swedish state in 1921. And so everything is preserved in this house, including the gymnasium, where the Countess used to exercise, very Swedish and outdoor. She used to wear long pantaloons and she'd do weights and things, so she was really quite a forward lady, I think. So there's the outside, and you go through the double gates. This was obviously where the coaches drove in, but it now is a lovely yard that the museum uses for functions and events, especially in the summer. And the interiors. So, the Hallwyl Collection is about 50,000 objects. The Countess collected everything. She collected paintings, she collected carpets, she collected silver, she collected furniture, she collected European ceramics, and she collected Asian ceramics. She had been influenced in this by her mother. Wilhelmina was a member of the Kemper family, and for those of you who know about Chinese art, Karl Kemper was a famous figure. He had a great collection. He was actually her first cousin once removed, so the collecting was in the family. And in the 19th century, Wilhelmina and her mother particularly would collect a lot of things together. So you see the interiors are beautiful and the house is maintained. It's a kind of mini Wallace collection, really, as it was when the Countess died, and you go to visit it and you see the contents as they are, and you can see, well, the lovely things that she collected. And on the top floor, there are 2 galleries, and this is one of them, stuffed full of Chinese things. And they're all still kept in the cases like that. So it's actually rather difficult to see them as a casual visitor. I obviously spent some time in there having things taken out and lifted down. And we've published a lot of the pieces in the book. So you can almost see them more clearly in the book than in the museum. But it's a wonderful collection. So who was this lady? Well, first of all, let's talk about her husband. Wilhelmina, she, as I said before, was born in 1844. She was the only child of a wealthy man who made his money through timber. And in the 19th century, that's how Swedes made their money, was through timber. And when her father eventually died, he was quite unusual in that he settled his whole estate on Wilhelmina. Now, I say quite unusual because, as we all know, in the 19th century, it was common to cast around for some male member of the family to leave the money to, but it all went to Wilhelmina. When she was 20, she married this man, Count Walter, who was actually Swiss. He was a nobleman. So Wilhelmina had the money, and he brought in the nobility. And he looks like rather a stuffed shirt, but actually he was apparently a very nice man and a good father to their 3 daughters. And he took over her father's business. He became general manager, and he ran the company very successfully. And he actually became a key member of Swedish society. I mean, he was Swiss, but he took on Swedish nationality. And he actually acted as a member of Parliament between 1897 and 1905. And he was highly influential in Swedish society. So this was really a kind of glamour couple. You know, the wealthy collecting lady and her husband, who was this businessman, very astute businessman, but also in politics. So there's Count Walter looking a bit stern in that photograph. And here's Wilhelmina. Don't you think she looks like an interesting person? Somebody you really might have liked to know. A very beautiful woman when she was young, I think. She started collecting, as I said, she was buying from quite young. The first Asian piece she bought was in 1879 at Bukowski's, the Swedish auction house, which is still open and still operating. She bought a pair of Japanese bowls, and that seems to have ignited her love of Asian ceramics. And she went on until her death in 1930. Now, the other extraordinary thing about this collection is that it is amazingly well documented. I was very interested to hear Caroline talking about Queen Mary and how she loved to note everything down. Maybe it's a female thing, I don't know. But anyway, Countess Wilhelmina kept extremely precise records of everything she bought. And there is an archive in the museum which contains invoices, letters to curators, everything to do with the acquisitions. I mean, it's a wonderful trove of material for provenance because, as we all know, provenance of works of art is extremely important, and this is really a wonderful treasury of that. She also commissioned in her lifetime catalogues of her entire collection. She employed curators and secretaries to write these catalogues, and they were very detailed. They were descriptive, but they also included details of who she'd bought from and other interesting facts about pieces. And the first catalogue was not actually published, huge things they are, until 1926. That's 4 years before she died. But the catalogues kept coming out slowly, and the last one was published in 1955, long after her death. And the catalogues are incredible. They were printed in very short runs, 110 of each catalogue, and the catalogues were sent to Swedish museums and some overseas museums, so they're rare books. But the copies that remain are just a treasure trove. But, of course, since 1955, and certainly since 1926, the world has moved on, and the scholarship in the catalogues, they sort of act as super grand inventories, but some of the scholarship needed to be updated, and that's where I came in. So they're gradually, the Hallwyl Museum is publishing catalogues, modern catalogues, contemporary catalogues of its collections, and that's what my book was. My book is not a catalogue raisonné, but it talks about the categories of ceramics and illustrates some of the best. So here's the Countess in old age. Apparently she was quite a Tartar, you know, she ran a strict office and making sure that everything was noted down properly. So, what's in the collections? I'll show you a sort of few highlights, some of the things I think are most interesting. The other thing I'd like to say about the collection is that it falls into two very neat halves. There's the half that contains material that was bought before 1905, 1906, and then there's the later period. Now, the reason for making that distinction is that, as I've already said about the engineering, before that time, China wasn't really open to people going to buy. And after that time, it was, and lots of people went to China, made purchases, and sent them back to Europe. So a lot of the later material in the collection was bought in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, purely from European sources, a lot from Bukowski's, but Bukowski's also bought for Wilhelmina in Germany, in Berlin, they bought in the Netherlands, and they also from London, SM Frank & Co., which is probably a company known to you, also sent consignments of goods on Bukowski's request to offer to Wilhelmina. After 1905, there's this opening up, and this archaeological material starts coming out of China, this stuff that's being dug up by the engineers and shipped to Europe via the dealers on the Trans-Siberian Express. They used to send consignments of goods which would reach Paris or Amsterdam and then would be bought on in London. So I'm going to show you the pieces in a chronological sequence, but you have to imagine this split in acquisition dates, how the character of the collection changed. And it's very interesting that Wilhelmina bridged this period, the old style of collecting and the new style of collecting. So here we're in the Tang dynasty, so we're in the 8th century, and this is a sort of burial figures. There's another one. And another one. These are the sorts of burial figures that were being dug up from the ground and shipped back to Europe. And in fact, for anyone who knows about Chinese ceramics, they're not particularly grand. In the last 30, 35 years, there have been much grander things coming out of China as they do excavation and pieces come out. You know, big, brightly colored, fantastic things. These are, you know, they're relatively small and simple in terms of the material, but it reflects what was available in the West in the 1910s, the 1920s. So it's very typical of that time. And we move on to the Jin dynasty, the 12th, 13th century. And again, this is the sort of material that would have been coming out of China. And I show you a few pieces because something I'll come back to. The Countess loved animals. She loved depictions of animals. So there's a particularly mad tiger on this pillow. This is actually a headrest. And there's a jar from a little bit later from the Ming dynasty with another mad tiger on it. So she really liked the decoration. She liked, I don't think, as far as I can tell, she wasn't particularly concerned with the Chinese meaning of the decoration, but she just liked this kind of thing. Now, at this stage, I should say something more about Orvar Karlbeck. You've probably forgotten about him. He was the first Swedish engineer who went out to China in 1905, 1906. And he was one of those people who was very instrumental in, because of his digging activities, in discovering these fantastic treasure troves from the ground, because he helped to build railroads in China. and all across North China into the northwest and down the east coast, which are really some of the heartlands, the cradles of Chinese civilization. So he found really fantastic things, which he started sending back on the Trans-Siberian Express to dealers in Europe. And in 1927, Orvar Karlbeck left China because China was becoming too unstable. You know, there was a civil war, there were bandits, there were warlords, and the Japanese were hovering in the north, ready to sweep down. So Orvar Karlbeck left China, but he went back in subsequent years on several buying missions for Western collectors. And these Western collectors are what we call the Karlbeck Syndicate. It sounds very sinister, but actually the Karlbeck Syndicate had very famous buyers in it. The British Museum was a member of the Karlbeck Syndicate. The great collectors, Oscar Raphael, George Eumorphopoulos, Mrs. Mariquita Sidgwick in England. In Sweden, of course, the Crown Prince and the King Gustav was a member. Wilhelmina acquired things from the first expedition, but she died too early to benefit from the full fruits of Karlbeck, who made further journeys to China in the 1930s and brought things back for this syndicate, this international, this European syndicate of buyers who funded him to go to China and bring things back for them. And Karlbeck, as I probably said, must have been an extraordinary figure. He wrote a wonderful book called Treasure Seeker in China, and it describes how he used to go around acquiring things. It describes the digs where people were digging things out of the ground and how he had to stop the peasant diggers from putting their pickaxe through anything that wasn't perfect. You know, he would sort of recover it. So it's an amazing book. So that's another kind of Swedish connection, and it relates to this material. So this is one of my great finds in the collection. It looks like nothing, does it? But it's actually a shrine of the Bodhisattva Guanyin, and it's made of porcelain, believe it or not. And this is the back of it. It's 45 centimeters high. It's a great big thing. And it was on a top shelf, and I had to get 2 strong men to lift it down because it weighed a ton. But it's a very, very interesting thing, and it's made of porcelain clay, and the back is particularly fascinating. It looks almost as if someone was making a cake. You can see all the potter's thumb marks as they pressed the clay into the mold. And this kind of porcelain shrine is well known now, but not when Wilhelmina bought it, I doubt. And I did quite a lot of research on this piece. It obviously was made to imitate one of the great rock-cut Buddhist shrines in China. So it's a figure sitting in a rocky grotto. You can see one here from one of the many, many sites, many Buddhist sites in China, actually carved from the rock. And as for dating, you can see the architectural details of this piece, which are so fascinating. The tiled roof and these little squiggly bits around here, they're very like excavated pieces, and this happens to be one that was dated 1338, which is in the Jiangxi Provincial Museum, which in fact is the museum of Jingdezhen, you know, Jingdezhen, the great porcelain city. So the real heart of Chinese porcelain. So it's very nice to tie up Countess Wilhelmina's porcelain shrine with pieces like this and to date them rather precisely. So that was an exciting find. The Ming Dynasty, that everyone has heard of, not a big collection, but some fine pieces of imperial porcelain. This is a rain-marked imperial bowl of the reign of Jiajing, which is mid-16th century. Very nice. And this, which is incredibly rare, this is a box in the shape of a silver ingot. And you can see, even if you don't know Chinese history, this is a very, very short reign period, 1567 to 1572, so it's 5 years. So that porcelain from this period is incredibly rare and sought after. This is a very nice box, and there's another box like this in the Imperial Collections, which is held in the National Palace Museum in Taiwan. So I was also jolly pleased to find this. Roof tiles. Now, there's not something which in the early 20th century Chinese collectors collected, because they were just bits of architecture, really. They were the things you put on the roofs of palaces or temples, but Westerners loved them because they depict these very sculptural figures on them. So here you've got two demons, and here, this one I particularly like. This is a celestial warrior with a black face riding along the roof ridge. This is a semicircular tile, so you imagine on the top of the roof, and it's like that. That would be the tile that went over the top. So he'd be right on top of the roof there. And roofs in China are very dangerous places, you know. They're the place that divides the human world from the world of spirits. So you really have to protect against what's going on in the world of spirits. And so on your roofs, you put these creatures to guard you. So they're guarding against the malign spiritual powers. So that's what these chaps are doing. And you can tell he's a celestial warrior because under his horse's hooves, that's a cloud. So he's riding along on clouds to kind of protect the building. Well, we think they're fantastic, but when at the time that Wilhelmina was collecting, Chinese people didn't, although I think they do so more now. And the other extraordinary thing I just have to tell you about roof tiles is, if you think about Chinese buildings, very tall buildings, these tiles are right up on the roof. You can't see them from the ground. I mean, they're right up there. You could only see them if you were flying across the building. So, they're unseen. This piece, a very ordinary Chinese blue and white bowl, but the extraordinary thing about it is the mounts and the gilding and the leather box, because this is a group of very rare pieces that were made for the Spanish market, or the Portuguese market, the Iberian market, perhaps I should say, or might even, experts disagree, they might even have been added in the Spanish colonies in the Americas. So these are quite a rare thing. And this incredible thing, this is an altar set made of porcelain. Now, can you see the height of the incense burner, 35 centimeters? So, it's big, and it's got handles on it. The whole thing is made of porcelain, but the handles, can you imagine setting porcelain handles into an incense burner? They needed to be secured so that they didn't fall off. The rope is not the original rope, but there are holes in the you can see the hole. There's a hole here and a hole here. So obviously when these things were made, they were thought to be so fantastically perilous that it was all roped together. And the whole incense set is covered with Taoist scenes, Taoist gods. You've got here the three star gods of long life and the lucky twins. And so these were obviously made for a Taoist temple in China. And I forgot to tell you, one of the interesting provenances, these were acquired from the Swedish consul in Hong Kong, who died in 1876. So, he had them jolly early. And this Congee Dish, it's a perfectly nice imperial dish, but to me the interesting thing is that it was bought from the Sanson factory in Paris, where it acted as a model for the firm to make copies of Chinese things. As you know, they did, like crazy, and they're all over the market. But here is actually one of the model pieces that they used, and the Countess, acquired it from Sanson. And here, I'm not going to show you lots of, but, it's wonderful to have the original receipts, the documentation to go with it. This dish would itself have been rather a not particularly precious thing in China. It was made for a 9th rank concubine. It was official porcelain, so it was kind of rather low class. Well, she's the kind of lowest of the low. But every member of the imperial family had to have properly decorated porcelain, every rank. So this is the concubine of the 9th rank. I'd said before that the Duchess loved animals, so I'm just going to show you a few. This is early 17th century. This is a beast called a Chilan, which is a magic creature that does all sorts of wonderful things. And this is a particularly mad one from the mid-18th century. You can see he's got his tongue hanging out, but he's a protective beast, and round his body he has this is flame. This is sacred flame. You can see it on this chap as well, because this magic creature appears wreathed in flame, but he doesn't look very fierce, does he? And lions, Buddhist lions, they look like Pekingese dogs. This is actually a tray, a porcelain tray with a wonderful painted blue and white lions. It's Kangxi period, about 1700. And lots of lions. Here are some Blanc de Chine ones, 17th century. This is a fantastic thing. It's a wall vase. Can you see on the back? It's flat, and it's got a little hole there. So you'd actually hang that on a wall and put things in it. And this chap, who's rather solemn, he dates to the early 18th century. He was quite large, actually. He sat on the mantelpiece in her drawing room. And these two, who are particularly mad, completely bonkers, they date to the 19th century, I think, but I think the Countess didn't particularly care about the date. She just loved the animals, which are quite endearing. A bit of export stuff. This is a wonderful tea set dating to the Yongzheng period, so the 1723 to 35. It's just unusual to find a whole tea set, or not in whole, but all the pieces in it. The hot water jug, the teapot, the spoon tray, and this is the highest quality of export porcelain. So, usually museums have got one teacup or one teapot, but there's a whole set in the museum. And they're beautifully painted, as you can see. That's rather a bad picture by me, but they're beautifully enameled round the whole piece, so they would have been very expensive when they were first made. And a few things with Swedish associations. Here's an export piece with Carl von Linné's design on it, a Linea Borealis. And here depicting a great event in Swedish history, when the then king, Gustav III, he achieved a coup d'etat, which they say consolidated royal power, which I think is a very good way of putting it. And some Blanc de Chine. I just like these because they're inscribed. So this has got an inscription from Buddhist, the Chan Buddhism. Chan is Zen Buddhist scripture. And this, which is a little teacup, which has this inscription down the side, and it says, white and red colours make a good contrast. And that sounds very bland, doesn't it? But what it means is that the porcelain was the white, and the tea, where this porcelain was made, they made wonderful red tea. So you put the red tea in the white cup, and that's how it was appreciated. And this persimmon-shaped teapot, which says, it's from a famous poem, a Tang Dynasty poem by Tulung, and it's the 6th line. The 6th cup reaches the zenith where you feel you can contact the immortals. Because when you drink tea, people think that you get real buzz from drinking tea. And I love the 7th line in this poem says, when you drink the 7th cup, you can't even describe how you feel. So it's drunk, kind of mad, but it's a lovely little teapot. And the last piece I'll show you is this figure of the great Tang poet Li Bai. The piece itself is 19th century, And it was bought at Bukowski's, as so many of the Countess's purchases were. Li Bai is another of those very attractive figures from Chinese history. He's a great poet. I mean, you can read Li Bai in translation. You know, Arthur Waley made some very good translations of Li Bai. He's a really beautiful poet. But he was also a great drinker. He liked his wine. And the most famous story about him is that he died when he was out in a boat at night, composing verse and drinking, and he tried to embrace the reflection of the moon in the water, and he fell overboard and drowned. So he's rather a kind of attractive figure. So that's the last of the pieces I'm showing you, but it really is a lovely collection, and I would like to say one more thing about the Countess before I finished. She really gets my vote because she left her house and all the contents to the state in 1921. She died in 1930. 1921 was the year that her husband died, Count Walter. She herself died in 1930, and she specified in her will that every director of the museum after her should be a woman. Which in 1930 was quite a thing. And so that continued, very good, until in 1968, the wonderful Swedes, they enacted equal opportunities, and so that overturned this thing. But I have to say that when I worked there, the director was a woman, the curator was a woman, and the registrar was a woman. So maybe Countess Wilhelmina's spirit lives on. Thank you.